The light of a binary sun, artfully filtered by the station's dome, cast long, peaceful shadows across the Solace Garden. It was a place of quiet remembrance, a meticulously curated landscape of flora from 100 worlds, dedicated to the memory of those lost in conflicts the Galactic Concord hoped were long past. Sergeant Kaelen Grim Rourke, a man whose true age was belied by the deep lines etched into his face and the distant look in his gray eyes, sat on a simple stone bench. The polished black granite beneath him was cool, a stark contrast to the warmth he felt was forever absent from his core. Today marked another anniversary of the K'tharr War's end, a day most of the galaxy celebrated as the dawn of a new era of cooperation. For Rourke, it was just another Tuesday to get through, weighted with ghosts. He watched a young Xylan family, their slender, feathered forms bright against the green, point out a shimmering, dew-kissed orphany bloom. Xylans. New to the Concord, barely a generation removed from their own world's unification. They knew peace. He envied them that even as a part of him buried deep, felt a protective urge. A slight shadow fell over him. He didn't startle. His combat senses, though decades dormant, were still a part of his fiber. He looked up to see a young Xylan female, her plumage a soft sky blue, holding a data slate with an almost reverent nervousness. Her large, intelligent eyes, the color of warm amber, held a mixture of apprehension and determination. "Venerable Sergeant Rourke," she chirped softly, her voice melodic, the standard galactic dialect tinged with the Xylan's characteristic trill. Rourke gave a slow nod. "Depends on who's asking, and venerable is stretching it." "My name is Lyra Vane," she said, inclining, her head in a gesture of respect. "I am a junior historian and archivist with the Concord Historical Institute. I was hoping I might speak with you about your experiences during the K'tharr War." Rourke's gaze drifted back to the memorial, while in the distance, where names too small to read from here were laser-etched into obsidian. "The official histories are quite thorough, I hear, full of glorious victories and unshakable human spirit." There was no bitterness in his tone, just a weary flatness. Lyra shifted, her delicate claws clicking faintly on the pathway. "They are venerable. They speak of humanity's courage, its remarkable capacity to endure and innovate, but they are broad strokes. My people, the Xylans, we are new to this galactic stage. We seek to understand the species who shaped it, and the records they speak of what humans did but not always how, or what it truly cost." Her gaze was earnest, and for a moment Rourke saw something beyond academic curiosity. He saw a genuine need to comprehend. He sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Cost. Yes, it always costs." He looked at her then, truly looked. She wasn't a ghoul seeking vicarious thrills from old battles. There was a purity in her intent. Still, the idea of dredging it all up. "I understand it may be painful," Lyra pressed gently, sensing his hesitation, "and I would not wish to cause you distress. But your perspective, especially concerning the Veridian Prime campaign, it is spoken of in hushed tones even now, as a turning point born from something extraordinary. Veridian Prime." The name was a brand on his soul. He could almost taste the metallic tang of recycled air, the grit of ferrocrete dust, the coppery scent of blood. Rourke was silent for a long moment, watching a breeze rustle the silver leaves of a Terran willow planted nearby. He'd refused countless requests like this over the years. The accolades, the eager questions from armchair generals, the politicians wanting a soundbite. He'd turned them all away. But this Xylan, there was no artifice in her. He finally met her gaze. "You want stories of human combat, Xylan?" His voice was low, rougher than usual. "They aren't sung by heroes, they're whispered by ghosts, by the ones who paid the price and the ones who collected it. It's not pretty. It's not glorious from the inside." He paused. "But listen close, and maybe you'll hear why we're still here. Why you're able to stand here asking these questions in peace? A flicker of something, relief, gratitude, crossed Lyra's face. I will listen, Sergeant. With the utmost respect. She activated her data slate, its surface glowing faintly. Rourke took a deep breath, the scent of alien blossoms suddenly cloying. All right then, Lyra Vane. Veridian Prime. It wasn't the beginning of the war, not by a long shot. But for those of us there, it was where the universe decided to show us just how deep the abyss went, and what we'd have to become to climb out. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the peaceful garden dissolved, replaced by a sky burning red. It began, as these things often do, with a sky that was too quiet. Rourke's voice dropped, drawing Lyra into the vortex of his memory. The sunlight of the Solace Garden seemed to dim as he spoke, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving light of a doomed system, Veridian Prime, an agri-world, humanity's breadbasket in the Attican Traverse, rolling plains of golden grain, interrupted by industrious, somewhat utilitarian cities built with Terran practicality. It wasn't a fortress, not by galactic standards. It had a defense fleet, yes. A handful of destroyers, a score of frigates, system monitors, proud ships crewed by brave men and women. Against a K'tharr sector fleet, they were dust motes in a hurricane. We knew the K'tharr were pushing into the Traverse, Rourke continued, his gaze fixed on a point beyond Lyra, beyond the garden itself. He was younger in his mind's eye now, a sergeant in the 7th Veridian Planetary Guard, lean and hard, but with none of the deeper weariness that clung to him now. Every day the reports got worse. Outposts going silent. Refugee ships, packed and terrified, limping into any port that would have them, telling tales of K'tharr pacification. We were on high alert, sure. But high alert on Veridian was like expecting a hailstorm and getting an asteroid impact. The memory sharpened, the jolt of the general alarm, a piercing shriek that cut through the mundane chatter of the barracks. The rush to action stations, the confused shouts, the gnawing anxiety that tightened every gut. The K'tharr didn't announce themselves with diplomatic niceties, Xylan. They didn't offer terms. One moment, the system was clear on long-range scan. The next, they were there. A void-rip transition perfectly executed, spitting out their lead warships almost on top of our outer orbital platforms. Lyra made a soft sound, her amber eyes wide. Rourke nodded grimly. Their ships were an insult. Sleek, black, like obsidian, blades, and so many. Our little fleet, the Veridian Skyguard, they went out to meet them. No hesitation, pure damn courage. His voice cracked almost imperceptibly. We watched from the ground, those of us planet-side, little sparks of light, on the main displays in command, blue for ours, angry red for theirs. He described the brutal one-sided battle, K'tharr disruptor cannons, light years ahead of human energy weapon technology, slicing through human shields and armor as if they were parchment, human ships, hopelessly outgunned, turning to ramming speed in their final moments, trying to take even one of the invaders with them. Explosions bloomed in the silent void, brief, brilliant novas of defiance. It was over in 3 hours, Rourke said, his voice flat. 3 hours to shatter a fleet that had taken decades to build, generations to crew. What was left of our ships, and they burned. For days their wreckage painted the orbit. That's what we started calling it. The Crimson Orbit. Every sunrise, every sunset, the sky bled for what we'd lost up there. On the ground, the planetary government, led by Governor Eva Rostova, tried to maintain order. But panic was a living thing. The K'tharr didn't immediately land. They consolidated their orbital dominance, a vast dark net closing around Veridian Prime. They jammed communications, cutting the colony off from the wider galaxy. Then came their terms, Rourke said, a sneer briefly touching his lips. Delivered by automated drone. Unconditional surrender. Planetary disarmament. Population to be interned in designated zones for processing and integration into the K'tharr Hegemony. They gave us 12 standard hours to comply. He remembered Lieutenant Eris Thorne, his CO, a man barely 30 but with old eyes, listening to the broadcast. Thorne's jaw was tight, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of a console. Private Lena Hansen, Sparky as they called her, a kid fresh out of Tech Academy with fingers that danced over anything electronic, was trying to punch through the K'tharr jamming, her face pale with frustration. 12 hours, Rourke repeated. Governor Rostova used 6 of them to try and negotiate, to appeal to some sense of galactic law of mercy. The K'tharr didn't even acknowledge her transmissions. His gaze hardened. The other 6 hours? She spent those preparing us for what was to come. And then, just before the deadline, with K'tharr landers beginning to detach from their motherships, she made her final broadcast. They couldn't jam her planet side, not completely. He recited it from memory, the words seared into his brain. To the citizens of Veridian Prime, to any human who might one day hear this, we were given a choice: chains or defiance. We choose defiance. We are Veridians. We are human. They may break our cities, but they will never break our spirit. Veridian Prime may fall, but it will be a thorn in your gut for eternity. Rourke looked at Lyra, whose own eyes seemed to reflect the distant fires of his memory. That was the moment we knew. No rescue, no surrender. Only the price we'd make them pay for every inch of our world. The first K'tharr landers touched down in the northern plains, their ramps hissing open to disgorge tall, heavily armored figures, their insectoid features hidden behind opaque visors, their movements precise and menacing. They advanced with terrifying, methodical efficiency, overwhelming the first lines of hastily assembled militia. They were like armored locusts, Xylan, Rourke said, his hands clenching unconsciously, and they were coming for us all. Months passed under the crimson orbit. Rourke continued, his voice a low rumble. Lyra Vane leaned forward, her data slate forgotten for the moment, captivated by the raw intensity of his account. Months of retreat, regrouping, and watching. The K'tharr systematically secure the surface of New Veridia, our capital. They were thorough, efficient. Every captured district was gridded, patrolled, locked down. Their spine leader, Vrock, we learned his designation from intercepted, heavily encrypted chatter that Sparky somehow managed to snag now and then, was a master of conventional warfare. He expected us to line up and be annihilated, or starve in whatever holes we'd crawled into. Rourke allowed himself a grim smile. But humans, Xylan, we're good at crawling into holes, and we're even better at making those holes damned inconvenient for whoever's trying to stamp us out. He shifted on the bench, the memory pulling him deeper. New Veridia was an old city, built on layers of its own history. Beneath the gleaming modern structures and the residential blocks the K'tharr now occupied, there was a labyrinth. Old mining tunnels from the planet's first colonial survey, forgotten service conduits for utilities long since upgraded and rerouted. Storm drains big enough to drive a ground car through. That became our battlefield, our hunting ground. Lieutenant Thorne, Rourke explained, had quickly realized that direct confrontation was suicide, so he'd retasked the surviving planetary guard units. They became phantoms striking from the shadows, then vanishing back into the earth. We learned to move like rats in the walls of our own city, Rourke said, his voice devoid of any romanticism. It wasn't noble. It was necessary. His squad, Thorne, Sparky himself, and a few other hardened survivors, became specialists in these subterranean operations. Sparky was our key. Rourke's expression softened fractionally as he spoke of the young technician. Give that girl a handful of broken circuits, a cracked power cell, and a roll of synth tape, and she'd build you a miracle. She cobbled together seismic dampeners from scavenged medical equipment so our footsteps wouldn't register on K'tharr ground sensors. She built jury-rigged comms that bounced signals through the dense rock, untraceable by their orbital surveillance. She even managed to tap into some of their unsecured perimeter sensor feeds, giving us fleeting glimpses of their patrol routes. Rourke described one such mission: a deep reconnaissance into a K'tharr-controlled sector. Their objective was to plant listening devices near a temporary command post Vrock's forces had established in what used to be the city's main library, a cruel irony not lost on the defenders. The tunnels were oppressive, Rourke recalled, his gaze distant. Cold, damp, the air thick with the smell of stale earth and our own fear. Every drip of water, every dislodged pebble sounded like a gunshot in the silence. We moved slow, painstakingly slow. The K'tharr were above us, their heavy footfalls occasionally echoing down, a constant reminder of the iron sky they represented. They reached a section directly beneath the library. Sparky, her face illuminated by the faint green glow of her custom optical rig, worked with delicate precision, bypassing a K'tharr seismic grid by creating a micro-loop in its power supply, something their doctrine manuals would never have conceived of. That's when it happened, Rourke said, his voice dropping further. Lyra held her breath. Sparky was fitting one of her whisper bugs into a ventilation shaft that led upwards. Her primary sound dampener, the one masking our immediate movement, sputtered. Just for a second, a tiny fluctuation in its power core, but it was enough. Above them, they heard it, the distinct chitinous scrape of K'tharr armor shifting. Then a series of guttural clicks, their form of short-range communication. A patrol directly overhead. No time to run, no time to hide properly, Rourke said. Thorne gave me a look. We knew the drill. No shots if you can help it. Noise travels too well down there. A K'tharr trooper, one of their heavily armored crushers, lowered itself through a maintenance hatch in the floor above, its multifaceted eyes scanning the darkness, its weapon held ready. It hadn't seen them yet, but it was systematically checking the access point. It dropped into the tunnel not 10 feet from me. Rourke's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet Lyra could feel the phantom tension. Sparky was frozen, bless her. Thorne was moving to flank, but the K'tharr was turning my way. I had my combat knife. Standard issue, monomolecular edge. Good for cutting wires, opening ration packs, or silence. He didn't elaborate on the brutal, close-quarters struggle that followed. He didn't need to. The haunted look in his eyes, the way his hand unconsciously tightened into a fist, spoke volumes. We got out of there, he said after a moment. Planted the bug. The K'tharr above eventually dismissed the brief sensor anomaly as a power surge. Typical. If it wasn't in their textbooks, it wasn't a real threat. The intelligence gleaned from that bug, and others like it, allowed the Veridian resistance to conduct pinpoint strikes on supply depots, ambush patrols, and generally make Vrock's occupation a living hell. Casualties on the human side were still tragically high, but for the first time the K'tharr were bleeding too. They were facing an enemy that refused to fight by their rules, an enemy that was part of the ground itself. Vrock grew agitated, Rourke said, a hint of dark satisfaction in his tone. We'd hear his rants on the command channels Sparky managed to decrypt. He called us subvermin, cowardly shadows. He ordered entire city blocks gassed, trying to flush us out of the tunnels. He sent specialized hunter-killer units, tunnel claws, they were called. We learned to hunt them too. He looked directly at Lyra, her avian features etched with a mixture of horror and awe. They mapped our cities, Xylan. Every street, every building. But they never mapped our desperation. Down there in the dark, with nothing but our wits and our will to survive, we were the monsters. And the K'tharr were learning to be afraid of the whispers in the tunnels. Our successes in the tunnels were pinpricks, Rourke admitted, his gaze turning somber as he continued his chronicle for Lyra. Annoying to the K'tharr, certainly. Morale boosters for us, definitely. But Vrock commanded an army. He could absorb the losses. We, on the other hand, were finite. Every soldier lost was a gap we couldn't fill. Every expended power cell, every used-up medkit, brought us closer to the end. He described the grim atmosphere in the central command bunker, a repurposed subterranean transit hub deep beneath the ruins of New Veridia's civic center. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of ozone from overworked purifiers and the faint, ever-present aroma of fear. Food was strictly rationed. Ammunition was counted bullet by bullet. Hope, Rourke said, was the scarcest commodity of all. We were bleeding out slow and steady, he told Lyra. Vrock knew it. He was content to tighten the noose, letting starvation and attrition do his dirtiest work. We'd intercept his communications. Sparky got quite good at plucking them out of the ether. He referred to our resistance as chaotic spasms, the death throes of an inferior species. Rourke's lip curled slightly. Arrogant bastard. It was Lieutenant Eris Thorne who refused to let them fade quietly into that grim night. Rourke remembered Thorne, his face gaunt, dark circles under his eyes, pacing the cramped confines of the command center like a caged predator. For weeks, Thorne had been a silent, brooding presence, poring over Sparky's decrypted K'tharr tactical reports, studying their patrol patterns, their response protocols, their almost slavish devotion to their sensor data. Then one day, Rourke said, Thorne called a meeting. Senior officers, squad leaders, us. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, but his eyes, they had a fire in them I hadn't seen since before the K'tharr came. Thorne laid it out. A plan, so audacious, so utterly reliant on bluff and technological trickery, that at first most of the room thought he'd finally cracked under the pressure. He called it Ghost Protocol. His logic was terrifyingly simple, Rourke explained. The K'tharr were overwhelmingly superior in firepower and numbers. They were also rigid, doctrine-bound, and utterly reliant on their technology. Their greatest strength, Thorne argued, could be their greatest weakness. The plan was this: fake a massive breakout attempt. Not a subtle infiltration, but a loud, desperate, seemingly foolish push towards the old spaceport on the city's western edge. They would use every last functioning vehicle, every able-bodied soldier they could spare to create the illusion of a significant force making a final, suicidal gamble for off-world escape. But the real teeth of the plan, Rourke continued, was Sparky. Thorne wanted her to use our limited long-range comms gear, boosted and modified to flood K'tharr sensor networks with ghost signals. Fake energy signatures of ships powering up in the old spaceport hangars, false troop concentrations, encrypted human command chatter indicating a full-scale evacuation. The K'tharr would see what their sensors told them was a major coordinated effort. The objective wasn't the spaceport. It was a derelict industrial sector a few kilometers east of it, a labyrinth of rusting factories, collapsed warehouses, and treacherous, unstable structures that Rourke's teams had meticulously, secretly prepared. The breakout would be a feint, designed to draw Vrock's primary mobile reserve, his elite hunter-killer units, into this pre-selected kill zone. Lyra's feathered crest quivered, but to fake such a thing, the resources, the risk? Exactly, Rourke affirmed. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. If Vrock didn't take the bait, or if he saw through the deception, we'd have exposed our remaining strength for nothing. We'd be slaughtered. Many in the command staff argued against it. It was too desperate, too reliant on the enemy behaving exactly as predicted. Rourke remembered Sparky's reaction. While seasoned officers blanched, the young technician's eyes had lit up with an almost manic glee. She saw it as the ultimate hack, Rourke said, a faint smile touching his lips. A way to use the K'tharr's own vaunted technology to tie their brains in knots. She started sketching schematics for signal amplifiers and spoofer arrays on any flat surface she could find, chattering about cascaded logic bombs for their comm networks. Thorne, however, was not just relying on K'tharr arrogance. He was counting on Vrock's personal arrogance. Vrock wanted us to break, Thorne had argued in that tense meeting. He wanted a decisive final battle to put on his record. A full-scale, desperate human attack is exactly what his ego expects, what his doctrine prepares him for. He won't be able to resist crushing it personally. Rourke's squad, Alpha 7, was tasked with the most dangerous part of the setup, infiltrating deep into K'tharr lines to plant a series of powerful, shielded signal repeaters that Sparky needed to make her ghosts convincing across the entire engagement zone. It was a suicide mission, plain and simple. If they were caught, the entire protocol would collapse before it began. Thorne looked me in the eye when he gave us the assignment, Rourke recalled. No apologies, no justifications, just that unwavering, burning intensity. He asked if we could do it. I told him we'd plant those damned repeaters in Vrock's own latrine if Sparky needed them there. Approval for Ghost Protocol was not unanimous, but Governor Rostova, her authority now more symbolic, but still deeply respected, gave Thorne her blessing. The alternative was to slowly wither and die. This, at least, was a chance, however slim. The next few days were a blur of frantic, clandestine activity. Rourke's team scouted routes, dodging K'tharr patrols by mere heartbeats. Sparky and her team of scavengers worked miracles, cannibalizing every piece of non-essential tech to build her illusion-making devices. Other units quietly prepared the industrial sector, rigging demolitions, creating choke points, and hiding weapon caches. The day before we launched, Rourke said. Sparky intercepted another of Vrock's internal dispatches. He was reporting to his superiors about the continued degradation of primitive human resistance. He stated, and I remember the words clearly, "The primitives are predictable in their desperation. Should they attempt any final organized spasm, prepare to crush this uprising decisively and make an example of them." Rourke allowed himself a rare, cold smirk as he looked at Lyra. Predictable? That was the one thing we stopped being the moment we took to the tunnels. And Vrock, for all his alien intellect and technological might, was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The night Ghost Protocol launched was blacker than a Void Dweller's heart. Rourke's voice grew hushed, drawing Lyra deeper into the oppressive atmosphere of his memory. A low, roiling cloud ceiling smothered New Veridia, reflecting the fires from the burning districts back down, painting everything in a hellish, flickering orange, perfect for ghosts. His squad, Alpha 7, had spent the preceding 48 hours in enemy territory, moving like specters through shattered buildings and corpse-choked alleyways. They'd planted Sparky's signal repeaters in the designated locations. Perilous. Work that had cost them 2 good soldiers, lost to K'tharr patrols they couldn't evade. The grief was a cold stone in Rourke's gut, but there was no time to mourn. Not yet. We were holed up in the rusted shell of a chemical processing plant on the edge of the target zone, the old Cain Mori industrial sector. Rourke continued. A sprawling nightmare of corroded pipes, decaying warehouses, and multi-level gantries. We called it the Screaming Maze, long before the K'tharr ever set foot in it, because the wind whistling through its broken structures sounded like souls in torment. Poetic, huh? The first phase of Ghost Protocol kicked off just before local midnight. From their hidden command bunker, Lieutenant Thorne initiated the feint. A handful of their remaining armored vehicles, engines roaring defiantly, charged towards the K'tharr lines blockading the old spaceport, firing wildly. Simultaneously, Sparky unleashed her symphony of deception. "You could almost feel it in the air, Xylan," Rourke said. The shift in the electromagnetic spectrum as her ghost signals flooded the K'tharr networks. Fake energy readings spiked around the spaceport. Encrypted human comm chatter, algorithmically generated but sounding utterly desperate and authentic, spoke of a massed breakout, of powering up long-dormant freighters in buried hangars. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. On their own scavenged, tactical displays, they watched K'tharr unit icons begin to shift. Vrock, as Thorne predicted, reacted with contemptuous speed. Intercepted K'tharr communications, quickly decrypted by Sparky, confirmed it. Spine leader Vrock was personally leading his elite ironclad legion, the heavily armed and armored core of his planetary assault force, not towards the actual breakout attempt at the spaceport, but towards the perceived source of the main human command and escape signatures, the Cain Mori industrial sector. He was going to cut off the head of the snake. He walked right into it, Rourke said, a grim satisfaction etching his words. Like a thresher maw to a seismic lure, as the first K'tharr heavy skimmers and armored transports rumbled into the periphery of the Screaming Maze, their powerful searchlights cutting sterile white swathes through the darkness, Thorne gave the signal. It wasn't a battle, Lyra. Not, at first, it was an unraveling. The moment Vrock's lead elements were deep enough, the humans struck. Demolition charges planted weeks ago erupted, bringing down weakened water towers to create instant barriers, collapsing sections of elevated roadways to block retreat, and opening sinkholes in the unstable ground beneath K'tharr heavy armor. Then came Sparky's second act. She didn't just feed them ghosts, she turned their own senses against them, Rourke explained. She found a way to tap into the K'tharr BattleNet's IFF, Identify Friend or Foe system. Suddenly, K'tharr units were tagging each other as hostile. Their tactical displays became a chaotic mess of false positives and contradictory orders. Human sniper teams, hidden for days in the metallic guts of the maze, began picking off K'tharr, officers identified by their distinct command frequency emissions. Small agile human assault teams, armed with plasma charges and improvised explosives, struck at the vulnerable joints of K'tharr walkers and the engine blocks of their skimmers, then melted back into the shadows before any coordinated response could form. But the real horror for the K'tharr, Rourke explained, was psychological. We used their own fears against them. The K'tharr, for all their bluster, had a primal aversion to certain sonic frequencies, high-pitched, dissonant sounds that apparently reminded them of some apex predator on their homeworld. Sparky had isolated these frequencies from some old xenobiological research files. We started broadcasting them through hidden speakers throughout the maze. Not loud enough to be pinpointed, just there. An unnerving, teeth-grinding thrum beneath the chaos of battle. They also broadcast K'tharr distress calls, taken from earlier engagements, looping them, distorting them, making it sound like their comrades were being slaughtered in every dark corner. They used holographic projectors, salvaged from amusement parks, to create fleeting images of human soldiers where there were none, drawing K'tharr fire and attention. Rourke's squad was in the thick of it, not as a primary assault force, but as troubleshooters, plugging gaps, relaying targeting information, and occasionally dealing with K'tharr units that got too close to the hidden command posts orchestrating the chaos. I saw one of their ironclad legionnaires. Rourke's voice was low, intense. A 7-foot behemoth in powered armor stopped dead in a cross corridor, its weapon lowered. It was spinning its turret, its optical sensors flicking wildly. It was alone, separated from its unit. And through my audio pickups I could hear it. It was emitting these low, guttural clicks. Rapid fire. Sparky later told me it was the K'tharr equivalent of a panic attack. The K'tharr military machine, so devastating in open conventional warfare, began to seize up. Their rigid command structure couldn't adapt to an enemy they couldn't see, to a battlefield that seemed actively hostile, to orders that contradicted their senses. Units fired on each other. Squads broke formation. Individual soldiers driven mad by the cacophony and the unseen terrors. It was a slaughter, Rourke admitted, his face hard. We weren't just fighting them anymore, we were dismantling them piece by piece, nerve by nerve. The screaming maze truly earned its name that night. The K'tharr did most of the screaming. He paused. The silence in the solace garden profound. Lyra looked pale, her amber eyes reflecting a deep understanding of the grim reality he was painting. Frock, from his command skimmer hovering just outside the main chaos, tried to restore order. But how do you command troops who no longer trust their own senses, their own comrades? How do you fight ghosts? Rourke finally looked at Lyra, his gaze piercing. We didn't just fight their bodies in that maze, Lyra. We crawled inside their heads. We used their logic, their reliance on data, their inherent xenophobia, and we twisted it all into a weapon they couldn't comprehend. That's a haunting you don't recover from. Not them. And maybe, he added quietly, not us either. The battle for the screaming maze raged for 6 horrific hours. By the time the first hint of Veridian's dawn painted the crimson orbit with streaks of gray, the K'tharr ironclad legion was a shattered remnant, and Vrock, for the first time since landing on Veridian Prime, was ordering a retreat. The screaming maze broke Vrock's elite, Rourke stated, but there was no triumph in his voice now. It was flat, heavy with the grim weight of what came next. It was a victory, yes. A bloody, brutal, desperate victory. But defiance, Lyra. Defiance always has a price. And Vrock was determined to make us pay it in full. The first rays of Veridian's sun, struggling through the smoke-choked sky, illuminated a scene of carnage in the industrial sector. Twisted K'tharr war machines lay like fallen metallic beasts, many still burning. The silence that descended was almost as unnerving as the cacophony that had preceded it, but it was a temporary reprieve. Vrock was humiliated, Rourke continued, his eyes distant, seeing not the peaceful garden but the inferno of memory. His pride, his reputation, the very doctrine he embodied, All of it had been shattered in that maze. And a K'tharr spine leader, when cornered and shamed, doesn't slink away. He lashes out. From his flagship in the crimson orbit, Vrock unleashed his fury. No more surgical strikes. No more attempts at strategic capture. Orbital lances, previously reserved for hardened military targets, began to rain down on New Veridia. Not on the tunnels, those were too deep, too dispersed, but on the surface, on known civilian shelters, on hospitals clearly marked with the red cross of the old Terran symbol, a mark the K'tharr had until then, largely, if contemptuously, ignored. He meant to burn us out, Rourke said, his jaw tight. To make the surface uninhabitable, to drive us from our warrens by sheer indiscriminate terror. The ground shook almost constantly. Buildings that had survived months of siege collapsed into dust. The air filled with the screams of the dying and the roar of K'tharr atmospheric fighters, strafing anything that moved. In the human command bunker, the mood shifted from grim satisfaction to horrified dismay. Lieutenant Thorne, his face a mask of exhaustion and strain, watched the casualty reports flood in. The Ghost Protocol had crippled Vrock's offensive capability on the ground, but it had also unleashed a new, more terrible phase of the war. Thorne had to make choices no commander should ever face. Rourke's voice was thick with remembered pain. Our forces were scattered, depleted from the maze operation. We couldn't defend everywhere. He had to decide which sectors to consolidate, which civilian shelters had the best chance of surviving, and which were beyond our capacity to protect. Rourke's squad, Alpha 7, depleted but still functional, was thrown into one desperate rearguard action after another, trying to buy time for civilians to evacuate to deeper shelters, trying to hold back K'tharr ground patrols probing the edges of the newly declared extermination zones. That's where we lost Sparky, Rourke said, his voice barely a whisper. Lyra made a soft, sympathetic sound. He recounted it with a detached precision, as if the memory were a specimen under glass. They were covering the retreat from a sector near the old university. K'tharr annihilator squads, heavy infantry, designed for urban pacification, were advancing street by street, flamethrowers and heavy pulse rifles spewing destruction. Sparky had been trying to reactivate a series of ancient blast doors to seal off a transit tunnel packed with refugees. She was exposed for just a moment too long, Rourke said. A K'tharr sniper got her, right through the shoulder, shattering the bone, severing an artery. We pulled her back, laid down covering fire, but he shook his head slowly. The bleeding was too fast. Medkits couldn't cope with that kind of damage. She looked up at me, her face so pale, eyes wide with shock, and tried to tell me the sequence for the doors. His voice caught. She died trying to save others. The loss of Lena Sparky Hansen was a devastating blow, not just tactically, but to the morale of the entire resistance. She had been their light in the dark, their miracle worker. Thorne took it hard, Rourke said. He'd sent her on that exposed task. He carried that like he carried every loss. Amidst the chaos, Rourke had a fleeting glimpse of spine leader Vrock. The K'tharr commander, enraged by his force's earlier inability to pinpoint the human leadership, had come planetside in a heavily armored command skimmer, directing the reprisals personally. Through a powerful though damaged optical scope, Rourke saw him on a distant elevated platform, observing the burning city. His mandibles were working, his posture rigid, Rourke described. Even from that distance, through the smoke and haze, I could see the fury radiating off him. It wasn't the cold, calculating logic of a K'tharr commander anymore. It was raw, personal hatred. His normally impassive alien features were contorted in a way that, on a human, you'd call pure rage. The human defenders, though battered and grieving, fought back with a renewed ferocity born of despair and defiance. They knew now that the K'tharr could be beaten, could be broken, and every act of brutality Vrock inflicted only hardened their resolve. They made the K'tharr pay for every inch, every life. The reprisals lasted for 3 days, Rourke concluded, his voice weary. 3 days of hell. We lost so many. Good people, brave people, but Vrock didn't break us. He looked at Lyra, a flicker of the old fire in his eyes. He wanted to break our spirit with fire, He only tempered it. He showed us the very worst his kind could do, and we were still there, still fighting, still spitting in his eye. That, Xylan, is a kind of victory too. A terrible, haunting kind. The K'tharr offensive on Veridian Prime, while not over, was fundamentally altered. Vrock's elite ground forces were decimated, his timetable in ruins. He had resorted to terror, and while the cost to the humans was horrific, his actions also signaled a strategic failure. The quick, decisive conquest he had promised his hegemony was now a bloody, protracted quagmire. The silence in the solace garden returned, thick and profound, broken only by the distant chime of a remembrance bell and the soft rustle of leaves. Kaelen Rourke slowly brought his gaze back from the abyss of memory to the young Xylan historian. Before him, Lyra Vane's amber eyes were luminous, reflecting a storm of emotions: sorrow, respect, a dawning, horrified comprehension. Her data slate lay untouched on her lap. After Vrock's reprisals burned themselves out, Rourke said, his voice regaining some of its earlier quietness, the siege of Veridian Prime dragged on for another standard year. But the dynamic had shifted. The Screaming Maze incident, as it came to be known in hushed K'tharr after-action reports that Alliance intelligence eventually got their hands on, was a turning point. He explained that while the defenders of Veridian Prime were never truly relieved in the conventional sense, no grand fleet arrived to drive the K'tharr away. Their savage, unyielding resistance had become a legend. The K'tharr Hegemony expected a quick, clean conquest, a demonstration of their might. Instead, Veridian Prime became a bleeding wound in their flank, a symbol of their fallibility. It consumed resources, troops, and prestige far beyond any rational calculation for a supposedly primitive world. Spine leader Vrock, Rourke continued, was eventually recalled from his command. Censured for gross underestimation of indigenous planetary resolve and excessive deviation from established pacification protocols, resulting in unacceptable asset attrition. That was the official K'tharr line, bureaucratic language for he got his multifaceted backside handed to him by a bunch of humans who refused to lie down and die. A faint, grim smile touched Rourke's lips. He was reassigned to guard ice mining operations in some forgotten nebula, a deep disgrace for a spine leader. Of his ambition, the prolonged, unexpectedly costly resistance on Veridian Prime, and similar tales of human tenacity from other contested systems, sent ripples throughout the K'tharr Hegemony. It forced their strategists to reevaluate the cost of conquering human space. We didn't win the war at Veridian Prime, Lyra, Rourke clarified, but we and others like us across the front, we showed them that humanity was indigestible, that trying to swallow us whole would choke their empire to death. Eventually, the wider war turned. Alliances shifted. The K'tharr, overextended and facing mounting resistance on multiple fronts, were forced into negotiations, then a bitter, reluctant peace. Rourke fell silent, the weight of his narrative settling around them. Lyra took a slow, shaky breath. Sergeant Rourke, Kaelen, what you and the others endured, it is beyond what our records could ever convey. The haunting, as you called it. I understand now. It wasn't just the fighting. It was the choices, the cost. Rourke nodded. The cost. Always the cost. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred, then back up at the Xylan. We lost Thorn eventually. Not in battle, but months after the K'tharr finally withdrew from Veridian. The strain, the things he'd seen, the orders he'd had to give, it hollowed him out. He just faded. His voice was soft, tinged with an old sorrow. Many were like that. The war ended, but the battles inside kept going. Lyra's feathery crest drooped slightly. Was it worth it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the question raw and honest. Rourke was silent for a long moment. He looked up, past the curated beauty of the solace garden, towards the transparent dome of the station, where the distant, indifferent stars of the galaxy glittered. He spotted a familiar pattern, the Orion's belt of old Earth, A constellation humans had carried with them to the stars, a celestial anchor. Worth it? He echoed, his gaze still on the starlight. When I hear children laughing in a park like this, Xylan children, human children, side by side, when I see species that were once enemies now sharing knowledge, building futures, when I see young historians like you, trying to understand, to learn from the past instead of just repeating it. He turned back to her, a profound weariness in his eyes, but also something else, a deep, unshakable conviction. Every scar tells a story, Lyra. Every single one we carry, visible or not. It speaks of a moment we faced the dark. Veridian Prime has a lot of scars. Our people have a lot of scars. His voice was low, but it resonated with a quiet power. They say we were here, that we faced annihilation and chose to fight with everything we had, with our minds, our bodies, our very souls, that we endured horrors that should have broken us but didn't, and that even after walking through hell we still taught ourselves to reach for the starlight again. He offered a small, tired smile. That's the echo they left, the ones who fell, the echo of Veridian Prime. It's a haunting, but it's also a promise, that no matter the shadows we pass through, the human spirit will find a way to burn. Sometimes it burns in defiance, sometimes in ingenuity, sometimes in sacrifice, but it always burns. Lyra's amber eyes were shining now, not with unshed tears, but with a fierce, understanding light. She slowly picked up her data slate, but didn't activate it. "Thank you, Kaelen Rourke," she said, her voice filled with a depth of emotion that transcended her academic role. "Thank you for sharing your echoes. They will not be forgotten." Rourke nodded, a sense of closure settling over him, fragile but real. He had passed on a piece of the burden. He had ensured the whispers of the ghosts of Veridian Prime would continue to be heard, not as a song of glory, but as a lesson, a warning, and a testament. As Lyra Vane eventually departed, leaving him once more to the quiet solitude of the Solace Garden, Kaelen Rourke looked up at the distant stars. The haunting was still there. It always would be. But for the first time in a long time, it felt a little less heavy, a little more like the proud, resilient, and deeply human story it truly was. A story of survival, a story of humanity, fuck yeah.